here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art with senior curator Shirley Reece-Hughes to talk about American Modernism from the Charles Butt collection. Shirley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This show is drawn from the Charles Butt collection, quite an extensive collection. How did you approach the material and how did you go about selecting and organizing the works for the show?
He has quite an extensive collection, and rather than doing a straight chronological hang of the artworks, I wanted to reflect Charles Butt's interests and his passions that came through as I looked at the artworks. And I think the various themes emerged to me in the way that he collects. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at all the works in his collection was that Charles Butt seemed very attuned to the vitality of human connections and artists who influence one another, whether as friends or teachers and students, or how this evolved, these different influences amongst artists. And the other thing that struck me was the intimacy of some of the artworks. These are artworks of private worlds and unique views sometimes that artists are depicting out their windows, from Alice Neal, who's best known for her figurative work and portraits of people, but this work from a rare series she did of Spanish Harlem when she was a working mother trying to raise 2 young children, and painted the view out her window. Also an artist like Alma Thomas, who her view out her window she distilled into an amazing abstraction, known for her daubs of color that evoke the rhythms of summer. It's entitled Summer at Its Best, and of course evokes that abundance. So that's the first theme in the show, is intimate perspectives, and also a look at artists who influence one another, like Guy Pen du Bois and Edward Hopper, who were lifelong friends, and of course Thomas Hart Benton, who was Jackson Pollock's teacher, and Charles Butt had selected a very early, unique work by Jackson Pollock that reflects that direct influence of Benton. Those works are in that section. Also, some very different views, different perspectives on family and how these artists depicted scenes of family.
The exhibition covers 18 works from 1885 through to like 1984 or so.
Yeah.
It's a century that included 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a huge shift in the American economy from a largely rural experience, agriculturally based, to an urban industrial experience. How does the show place the works in that context, and why was now the time to show it?
Well, this is part of the reasoning behind organizing it thematically, because the 20th century, these are responses largely to the 20th century, the changing dynamics, as you mentioned, from a rural to an urban industrial society. And a lot of the works reflect, these are artists' responses to that change. I'll also mention the area entitled The Language of the Sea, which is a reflection of Charles Butt's upbringing in Corpus Christi. Of course, he's a sailor himself, has a sailboat, and so loves the sea. But marine painting is also a very iconic part of the Western canon of American modernism. And in these pictures, you also see artists responding to the changing seas, the changing coastlines, as industry moved in, as the country evolved. You also see that in the next section entitled Land Progressions, where you're looking at artists who are responding to different landscapes, sometimes places that were home, sometimes places that they specifically traveled to seek inspiration, and sometimes a response to this new industrial era. Also, sometimes artists in that section are reacting against the industrial urban era and going to more rural, natural spots to seek inspiration from the landscape as spiritual, looking at the land and nature as something very spiritual at a moment of dramatic change in the country.
Speaking of those dramatic seascape views, one of the things that Charles Butt is quoted saying is that he was drawn to paintings with great water, great sky, and great soul. And so when I look at a work like John Marin's My Hell-Raising Sea, how does it reflect Butt's interest in those 3 great things?
Well, when you look at that work, it's really fascinating because it's that balance of abstraction and realism that Marin was known for. But it's not simply an abstraction. It's like he's capturing nature. He's capturing the sense of the tides and the waves. So he's attuned to that. And it has a luminous sky. It has this rapidity and motion that the ocean evokes. And it has meaning. It has, Maine was a very important place to John Marin. That's where he died. Of course, he's known also for his New York City pictures. Grew up in New Jersey, but he, did series of paintings of Maine. And of course, Maine is also an important place for Charles Butt.
So Butt talks about Marin as a bridge between, as you mentioned, figurative painting and 20th century abstraction. How do works by John Marin influence someone like Joan Mitchell's landscape for Friend?
Well, John Marin, because he did that striking balance between abstraction and realism, still rooted in place, still looking to the landscape, but because of his experiments, because of being able to move from a sense of flatness in the picture plane to dynamic energy and movement, it really sort of broke with tradition. And so he's creating a new sort of innovative path. And I always think of artists who sort of start these paths. There's a Winslow Homer in the show, the 1885 scene of the Bahamas. And that Winslow Homer was critical for Marin because Winslow Homer was painting that painting of watercolor outdoors and capturing this, unique scene on site. And then that's something that he broke that tradition. That was something new that Homer was bringing to watercolor that inspired artists like John Marin, who then started working outdoors, working in watercolor. So you see that sort of connection. Marin was fascinating because he would toggle back and forth. So he'd do very extreme abstract views, but still always sort of a reference to reality, but then more, representational views. And I think his experimentation was important for artists of the abstract expressionist group like Joan Mitchell.
The collectors also noted that he has made an intentional effort to include underrepresented artists in his collection. What are some of the highlights of this effort?
Yeah, so Bill Traylor, an artist who really didn't see recognition until, starting sort of in the latter half of the 20th century, born enslaved and worked in Alabama for most of his life. And then very late in his life, picked up discarded pieces of cardboard and started creating scenes. And they're truly remarkable for his understanding of line and space for someone who'd never been taught the fundamentals of art. Then you have an artist like Alma Thomas, who's now received a lot of recognition, working, of course, in the middle of the 20th century, started coming to her mature style in the 1960s, part of the Washington School, just devising a really optimistic abstract style. And she's now being recognized, of course, for her achievements, but at the time was not recognized. An artist like Jacob Lawrence, The Wall, which he created in tandem with his famous Migration series, which is a striking view of a family that's divided from the world with a large wall that reflects the segregation ongoing and the ongoing Jim Crow laws that artists of color were experiencing. So those are some of the highlights.
You mentioned earlier the relationship between Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak for a moment about how the works in the show really show that the way the artists' mentorship relationship developed.
With Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock enrolled in Benton's art class at the Art Students League in New York City, and Pollock was 18 years old at the time. And Benton immediately became a father figure to him, and a mentor and a teacher. And Pollock became part of the Benton family. So when Benton was looking, in 1920, went to Martha's Vineyard to be rejuvenated, ended up buying property there, and then would spend part of his life there, and there's multiple works in the show that Benton depicted in Martha's Vineyard, but Pollock would also go out there with the Bentons, so he was like part of the family. And there's a unique painting that Charles Butt discovered by Jackson Pollock. That's an early work that really reflects Benton's direct influence, and Pollock had based it on Benton's sketches of Borger, Texas, which was of course a boomtown of oil, and that's part of the reason Benton had depicted it. But you see that direct influence. But Pollock later, after becoming a famous abstract expressionist, disparaged Benton, but of course we know so much of Benton's rhythmic, pulsating lines as he strove to capture the energy of modern America influenced Pollock in his own abstract drip style.
Precisionism is a mid-century style that emphasized geometric forms and clean lines that's been called both realistic and abstract. Several artists associated with that movement are in the show, including DeMuth, Ralston Crawford, and Charles Sheeler. How did the style reflect its time?
Well, the style emerged in the interwar period, and so there was this moment of looking for stability. And Precisionism was really based on Cubism and that division of the picture plane, but in a much more representational fashion. And so American artists, as you mentioned, like Charles Sheeler, Charles DeMuth, Ralston Crawford, even artists like Georgia O'Keeffe was known for some of her precisionist paintings. They're not in the show, but there was that moment where that style emerged, and it was geometric. It was a clean line. It evoked a sense of stability in this, chaotic moment in the world where, fears of what's happening and of course, the rise of Germany and what's happening abroad in this interwar period, before the Second World War. So it was a critical movement for American artists, and it was a way, and of course, during this period, Americans were looking for a way to break away from European influence. They were trying to devise their own styles, their own methods and interpretations of, and of course, American landscape was part of that inspiration. It obviously distinguished American art from European art. So Precisionism became a really prominent style. George Alt also in the show. Examples, as you mentioned, by Ralston Crawford kind of reflect this moment of popularity of Precisionism.
So Oscar Blumener's In Scarlet and Black behind us is really striking composition from 1932. What is Oscar's Mr. Blumener's story?
Oscar Blumer began studied as an architect, and that architectural influence, that understanding, influenced the rest of his career, and you can see it in this work, although it has sort of a poetic title. But it's a place, he often depicted places in New Jersey. There's a sense of distill, that reference to architecture, also Cubism. It's representational yet abstract, and of course, as you can tell from this really vibrant palette, you see he became known for this really striking and dramatic palette of his own between the red and greens, which you've seen. There's variations on this. We have a study of the work to the left. Charles Butt has also, in his collecting parameters, when he could, evidently acquired studies for artworks. We have a study on a Shaker theme, a study for the larger work that Sheeler did. And I think it provides an opportunity for visitors to understand how the artist thought of the composition. What was the original idea for the composition and how did he begin it? So Blumener became known for, these really, he allowed color to say so much in his work.
And I can just imagine him going through 1,000 different variations on that red before he found exactly the right one to go with this black. It is just so impactful.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, Shirley, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.